A series of violent armored car robberies terrorized New England. Using overwhelming firepower, a gang of gunmen strikes quickly and then vanishes, leaving few clues. When the robbers turn to murder, police race to capture them before they take more innocent lives. But to find them, investigators must first shatter a deadly code of silence. In this program, some of the names have been changed. In the early 90s, a rash of armored car robberies struck New England. 13 occurred in 1993 alone. By the next year, armored car couriers like New Hampshire Guards Wes Anderson and his partner Ron Normando prepared themselves for the possibility they could be next. They usually began their route each morning with hundreds of thousands of dollars to be dropped off at local businesses and banks. On this day, they had over $500,000 in their truck. The men were well aware of the danger in carrying that much money. But in all the previous attacks, none of the armored truck crews were seriously injured. Inside the 12-ton truck, they were practically invulnerable. They were protected by walls of thick armor, strong enough to withstand massive amounts of firepower. The windshield and windows were made of bulletproof glass. The truck was a virtual rolling fortress. But even with all the armor, the trucks were at risk.
Got 1 minute to go, boys. 1 minute.
At 9:10 a.m., Anderson and Normando pulled into the parking lot of a bank in Hudson, New Hampshire. The men were unprotected only when entering and exiting the vehicle.
Going in.
Okay. Okay, get ready. Thank you very much.
You have a good day.
The robbers waited for their window of opportunity.
Here it comes.
Then it came. This robbery would be tragically different from the ones that occurred earlier. People in the bank heard the shots. A teller activated the alarm and called police. The robbers had only a few minutes before the police arrived. They wasted no time making their getaway. Witnesses noted the make and model of the maroon minivan as it sped away. They also noticed a white car that seemed to be part of the fleeing convoy.
Bank robbery? Where? Where is it? Bank on Lowell Road? They shot a guard? Okay, stand by.
Hudson 911 received the call.
Be advised, we have a 100 green in progress. Shots fired. Debbie, can you just notify Sergeant Miller what's going on? Okay, please go possible. Okay, how many people are involved? Okay, stand by. Angela, can you notify the chief and the captain and let them know what's going on?
Hudson Police Chief Richard Gendron was alerted.
It's confirmed. Right, why don't you notify the captain and have him meet me out back? There was 10 to 15 officers that were in training. We entered the room and said, everybody, get in a vehicle, get your bulletproof vests on. We have an armed robbery in progress.
Charlie 1 headquarters en route.
That hostages were taken and shots were fired. That's when all your training and everything comes into place. As we approached the site, the officers who were on duty were dispatched to take positions around the bank, set up some perimeter control.
When police arrived at the bank, they questioned the witnesses. They couldn't describe the robbers because they wore masks, but they described the getaway cars.
We learned that they had just left, and that's the clue, was that armored cars don't move that fast. So we knew they had to be still in Hudson.
Officers were dispatched to find the missing armored car.
Hold up, the Hudson Bank.
Witnesses told us that the guards were overpowered. They heard a round go off, they saw the guard go down on the pavement, and then they picked him up and threw him in the back of the armored car. And then there were other witnesses that thought they heard a second shot inside or as they were going into the armored car.
From the witnesses' accounts, police determined the gunman had automatic weapons. They had to find the wounded guards quickly if the men were to survive their injuries.
This incident quickly turned from bank robbery to possible homicide or hostage situation. You're now focusing your attention on something totally different. And now you know you're dealing with people who are not afraid to use deadly force.
Police set up roadblocks at all the roads in and out of town.
We felt if we could contain them in this community, our chances of apprehending were much better. Their main objective was to look for any stolen vehicles that were involved in this armed robbery and any of the suspects.
With the roadblocks in place, Hudson police began a street-by-street search. To widen the search area, they notified New Hampshire State Police and Massachusetts authorities just over the state border. The state police helicopter took to the air to try and locate the armored car. They began by scanning the neighborhood near where the robbery took place and worked outward. At the bank, officers combed the parking lot searching for any evidence that might identify the robbers and give them some idea of where they took their hostages. All they found was Ron Normando's clipboard. The gunmen were careful to leave little else behind. On the roads leading out of Hudson, police kept a vigilant eye out for anything out of the ordinary.
It was like looking for a needle in a haystack. The neighborhood near the bank robbery there's a lot of wooded areas, a lot of places where you could easily drop off a stolen vehicle and get away. And it also takes us a lot of time to search those areas because there's a lot of dirt roads going into them.
20 minutes after the robbery, police got a break when an officer saw something glinting in the sunlight through the dense woods. As he got closer, he thought he heard the sound of a diesel engine running. When he lowered his window, his suspicions were confirmed. Deep in the woods, he saw the outline of an armored car and a maroon minivan. Chief Gendron warned him to exercise caution.
I advised the officer to try to establish some point of surveillance until I arrived with other units. But under no conditions whatsoever attempt to go in there until backup arrives. We knew we were dealing with professionals. We figured right away that they probably had counter surveillance. They knew we were coming. They were probably monitoring our frequency.
Officers were unable to see through the thick brush to assess the situation. Because they could hear the engines of the armored car and the van running, they thought the gunman might still be inside.
The best situation we're hoping for is that those who were responsible for this armed robbery would have simply taken the money and left the guards uninjured. Is it possible that the guards are just tied up and left there? Is it possible that the robbers are still there? And then the thought comes in that, are we going to end up in a gun battle?
All the officers were wearing bulletproof vests, and one of the patrol cars had a single ballistic shield. They were outmanned and outgunned by the suspects. But knowing the hostages were probably wounded, they did not have time to wait for SWAT to arrive. They had to go in. The men prepared with what little protection they had.
There was only 3 of us that entered the woods. I made a decision to do that, basically because we thought there was an urgency to get in there and get the guards to save them. It wasn't any one of us that was going in that woods that didn't have the jitters and was wondering what was going to pop out at us. We didn't know if the bad guys were hiding in the woods waiting for us and were going to ambush us. We didn't know if they were inside the van.
At least they had some protection from bullets. But if the suspects were holed up in the truck with automatic weapons, the shield and vests would be no match for the criminals.
They could have easily came out of the woods or any one of those vans and end up in a firefight. They weren't going to hesitate to fire any rounds because they just did it at the bank.
The officers found no suspects in the vehicle. Only the motionless body of the truck's driver, Wes Anderson.
Got a guard down.
Next, the officers moved toward the suspect's other vehicle, the maroon minivan. It held an equally gruesome discovery. The dead body of the armored car's courier, Ron Normando.
Very clear you could see it was an execution. They didn't have to do that. This is probably one of the most horrific crimes we have seen in many years. It was a senseless killing of 2 individuals.
The robbery investigation had become a double homicide case.
There's a sense that we are going to get these guys. We are definitely going to get these guys, no matter what it takes. Everybody had that mission, was to find them.
The area became a crime scene, and the medical examiner was called in. Because the crime began at a federally insured bank, the FBI and U.S. Attorney's Office joined the investigation. Before crime scene technicians could begin their work, the representative from the medical examiner's office had to examine the bodies. But the armored car was still locked. The heat from the running engine might affect the body, making it more difficult to conduct an accurate examination, according to Deputy Medical Examiner Kathy Deschanel.
We were very concerned about that heat causing artifactual changes in the body and also obscuring our ability to recover critical evidence from that body. So we were very, very wary of leaving those vehicles running. We were very concerned about getting them shut off as quickly as possible and also monitoring what was happening to those bodies because of the heat during the course of that afternoon.
They had to get the armored car opened up and turned off. They called for the keys to be brought in. While they waited, Hudson Police and Sergeant Ray Mello took extraordinary measures to preserve the dirt road leading to the vehicles.
Decision was made to go through the woods, maybe 50, 75 yards up the street, and actually take a chainsaw and cut through the woods. Our crime scene people could access the scene that way, and we wouldn't be trampling on any evidence that was left behind in that dirt road.
Since the doors of the maroon van were already open, The medical examiner documented the condition of Ron Normando. He had been handcuffed and suffered multiple gunshot wounds. Duct tape covered his eyes and bound his ankles. He had one gunshot wound to the side, probably sustained at the bank. The other was to his head, an execution wound.
This was easily one of the most brutal crimes that I've ever seen in my career. And from that perspective, we knew that we had an uphill job trying to gather evidence and see this to a successful conclusion.
Police ran the van's license plate and learned it was reported stolen 2 days earlier from a New Hampshire shopping center 40 miles away. The path to the crime scene was now clear, and the rest of the investigators had access to the vehicles. The van's ignition was damaged. The screwdriver stabbed into the seat was probably used by the suspects to start the vehicle. Police escorted a supervisor from the armored car company to the locked truck. His keys would unlock more horrific evidence inside. While police painstakingly processed the evidence, a gang of heavily armed killers was on the loose. If they could not uncover some clue that would lead to their capture soon, authorities feared more people would die. In Hudson, New Hampshire, 2 armored car couriers were shot in a robbery attempt. Hudson police found the armored car and one of the suspects' getaway vehicles in the woods. The guards had been murdered. When investigators opened the armored car, they found only several bags of coins left behind by the robbers. Lying near the money was the body of the second guard. He had been shot once in the leg. The forensics investigator noted 2 gunshots to his head, suggesting he had also been executed. The guard's body was examined by Kathy Deschanel.
He had bled a considerable amount. There was blood everywhere. That speaks to 2 things. The first is that he had to be alive to bleed, so he was laying there bleeding for a period of time. The multiple wounds speaks to the degree of violence.
Investigators were finally able to turn off the armored truck's engine and process it for evidence. As professional as the robbers seemed in their operation, they left behind important clues. Sergeant Ray Mello worked the case.
We found a mask in the armored car, which was important. It gave us an idea that one of the suspects may have lost his mask, and potentially that may have been why one of the guards was shot, was that he had seen the face of one of the suspects.
Send it up to the lab.
Crime scene technicians sent the mask to the FBI's lab for DNA analysis in the event the suspect left saliva, skin, or hair on it. Police found their efforts to preserve the dirt path leading to the vehicles paid off.
The most significant piece of evidence was this tire print. We knew that none of the responding police vehicles had made that track. And, you know, having found the armored car, having found the van right down the dirt road from where this path was, we had a real good idea at that time that it was probably made by some getaway car vehicle. So our primary importance right away was to preserve that tire track.
To preserve it, evidence technicians would make a mold.
So we get pictures of everything here.
Once the mold was formed, they would have an exact representation of the tire impression. Technicians could compare it to the tread on any suspect vehicle. Using dental stone, they carefully covered the track. because each time a tire hits the road, it changes the wear pattern. They'd have to find the vehicle quickly to make an accurate comparison. Officers at the site put out word through the media they were looking for any information on the robbery and murder of the two guards. The news reports were broadcast across the region, according to Hudson Police Chief Gendron.
The press was everywhere. News crews from the city of Boston are coming into the area. We immediately gave them a press release on what transpired and kept them informed, and they in return gave out information to the general public, what we were looking for, description of vehicles, suspects.
While the crime scene was being processed, police and FBI agents canvassed homes and businesses near the bank and the location where the bodies were found. They were looking for anyone who might have seen anything unusual.
How you doing?
A mechanic nearby recalled hearing a diesel engine running in the woods earlier that day, which he thought was odd. He walked over to check it out and saw a yellow rental truck parked in the woods. The mechanic gave police the name of the rental company and a detailed description of the truck. Ray Mello thought they were fortunate he was a mechanic.
It was a specific type of moving van. It's called a cab over, which means the engine's kind of underneath the cab. He could actually describe the type of engine, how many cylinders. I mean, he was that good just by sound. Luckily, he had at one point thought about going down and talking to the people in the yellow rental van, thinking they may have been broken down. Didn't really know why they were stopped there. Something happened. He decided not to do that, which was probably the best decision he's ever made in his life.
Troopers continued to broadcast a request for any information about a yellow rental truck or the white car witnessed leaving the scene.
It is the largest size, what we believe is a 24 or 25-footer, yellow in color, which would denote it as a definite former rental, and that's what we're looking for at this point.
They got a call from a woman who said she was driving down the road near where the armored car was found when she was nearly hit by an approaching yellow truck, followed closely by a white sedan. Her description of the truck matched the one given by the mechanic.
Her coming forward kind of confirmed for us this yellow rental van. Again, we saw it at the scene, and now we've got somebody seeing it driving away from the scene and away from Hudson. So it gave us an idea of at least the direction it was going.
The information was given to police officers throughout the region.
Police bulletins were sent out to numerous towns on the way from people either going to Boston or coming up to New Hampshire either way, looking for this yellow moving van. Hundreds of these vans were pulled over and checked out, which was good because we knew the information was getting out there and that the law enforcement community as a whole were looking for these killers.
No,
Of all the trucks the troopers pulled over, none of them could be linked to the murders. As night fell, law enforcement could finally remove the men's bodies from the woods. They would be examined further by Kathy Deschanel.
There really was very little that I could tell the investigators immediately at the scene. From a medical examiner standpoint, in this particular type of a crime, most of the evidence that we're going to collect is going to be collected at autopsy. So it was most important that we get these bodies to our office in Concord where we could do a much more thorough examination.
The vehicles were also removed from the crime scene. They had been thoroughly processed. The maroon minivan was covered with gray fingerprint dust. The guards' bodies were transported to the state medical examiner's office. There, Deputy Medical Examiner Kathy Deschanel hoped to find clues to help police track down the killers.
We examine the bodies very carefully for physical evidence and remove and protect all of the physical evidence that we can. Because it was obvious to us that there had been physical contact between perpetrator and victim, we wanted to do everything possible to recover anything that might have been on the victims.
One of the first things medical examiners look for are fingerprints left on the victim's skin by the perpetrator.
I'm preparing a mixture of magnetic black powder and Blitz green fingerprint powder. This is what we use to do latent prints on the skin. If you use magnetic powder, you don't actually have to physically touch the skin with anything but the powder. You need just enough fluorescent powder so that you can fluoresce the minutia under the lights. Okay, so that's set up and ready to go. You get a clump of powder affixed to a magnetic wand, and you literally drag the powder across the skin. And if there is a print there, the powder will adhere to it and you can develop the print. We were able to see right away that he had some very significant finger marks on his arms. This looks like somebody grabbing him and pulling him, or trying to pull his arms behind him. I just want to take a look, though. I don't see any minutia, but I want to look very carefully. You tend to see little fragments of the skin ridges, and there's absolutely none. They're totally smooth.
Kathy Deschanel pursued every possible piece of evidence.
It was important to us to do the absolute best that we could do with every bit of tools and every bit of knowledge that we had in our arsenal, so that we could get the best possible information for law enforcement, so that they could then take it the next step and try to identify who did this and capture them.
The medical examiner used a black light to see the prints.
I can see the 3 imprints, but they're extremely smooth. Whoever did this was wearing gloves. There's not one shred of ridge imprint down there.
Unfortunately, the marks weren't much help.
Frustration comes in not being able to find something that readily ties these gentlemen to a particular perpetrator or a particular weapon. We did everything scientifically possible and humanely possible in that morgue to secure every minute piece of evidence, every microscopic piece of evidence that we could have.
As the medical examiner continued her work, investigators were still no closer to finding the killers. The New Hampshire armored car heist turned fatal when 2 guards were brutally shot and killed. The medical examiner, Kathy Deschanel, believes both men were still alive when the bank robbers executed them.
What was done to these gentlemen was done as much to kill them as to hurt them. And that information we thought was very important. There was cruelty involved in the infliction of these wounds on these men, and that we could very clearly see at autopsy, and that bothered us terribly.
At the site where the bodies were found, the gunman abandoned the armored car in a stolen maroon minivan with a handicapped sticker. FBI agents contacted the vehicle's owner, who said the van had been stolen a few days earlier, but it didn't have a handicap sticker. Chief Gendron surmised the gunmen placed the sticker on the minivan themselves to gain easy access to the armored car.
Well, what we believe happened was that the bank robbers steal a handicap plate or a handicap sticker and put it in the back of the van, so in case anyone drove by, whether it be the police or someone else, it wouldn't look out of the ordinary. And as that armored car would pull up right in front, which is right near the handicap space, they would quickly exit the van and overpower the guard as he stepped out.
Investigators set up headquarters at the Hudson Police Department. U.S. Attorney David Vicinanzo joined the investigation. He would prosecute the bank robbers when and if they were caught.
This was a case where I knew that while there was extremely little evidence to go on, I knew in my gut that this could be solved. Probably more importantly, I felt that it had to be solved. It was such a gruesome case, such a grisly, cold-blooded case. I knew it was going to happen again if we didn't stop it.
Police turned their attention to their next lead. Witnesses described seeing a yellow rental truck fleeing the murder scene. Sergeant Ray Mello began searching for the truck.
We grabbed a phone book and started looking at rental agencies, not only in southern New Hampshire, but, the Boston area, because we are on the Massachusetts border. So we just started calling around to rental agencies and trying to talk about, do you have this specific, cab-over design rental truck?
Mello learned rental agencies had only a handful of cab-over or snub-nose type trucks fitting the description given by the mechanic.
Were you able to see who the driver was?
They obtained the rental records for the vehicles matching that description, rented in a 50-mile radius of Hudson. Several of the names on the documents listed Massachusetts addresses.
Timothy Newton.
New Hampshire State Police phoned their counterparts in Massachusetts and ran the names by them.
The time is critical.
One of the names, Patrick McGonigal, was familiar to Massachusetts trooper Edward Troy. His identity has been hidden to protect ongoing investigations.
Well, McGonigal was fairly well known. He had a history. He was with Irish organized crime elements in the city, so he was known to us. McGonigal, who was just the guy that wanted to get his finger in any kind of criminal activity going on, to get his finger in and get a piece of the pie.
McGonigal was a crime boss from a notorious neighborhood of Boston called Charlestown. In the early 1990s, organized crime gangs ruled the streets. Police worked in vain to break their hold on the neighborhood. For generations, the criminals enforced a strict code of silence. Anyone who cooperated with law enforcement was marked for death.
If you consider the fact that it's a 1 mile square area surrounded by water and the highway, Route 93, somewhat isolated from other sections of the city, you consider that it's a small, tight-knit group of blue-collar people. Most of these people know each other, many of them related, and the fact that the criminal element were quite vicious. As a result of all those things, people are not very forthcoming. They're not going to come forward and speak to the police without reprisals.
Law enforcement had been watching McGonigal in Charlestown for years. As one of the more established criminals in Charlestown, McGonigal was a planner, relying on younger crooks to carry out his elaborate schemes.
Many of the younger criminal element in Charlestown, they looked up to these people. They were like folk heroes.
McGonigal was one of these folk heroes, with a reputation for being ruthless. U.S. Attorney David Vicinanzo worked many cases involving criminals from Charlestown and knew the chances were slim anyone would ever inform on Patrick McGonigal.
There was a culture in which the residents of the town never told on anyone else. Even law-abiding citizens were living in fear of ever saying anything about any of the criminals that were living in their midst. And unfortunately for Charlestown, there were a lot of criminals living in their midst.
Undercover investigators hit the streets to try and break down the code of silence surrounding McGonigal. It was just as they suspected. No one had any information on the crime boss.
They learned pretty early on in life that rats get killed, that people who tell are likely to end up with a bullet in their head. That was the culture that we were confronted with.
With no one talking, the investigators would have to find some physical evidence that might tie McGonigal to the robbery. Having him as a suspect was a big break, but Sergeant Mello knew the investigation was only beginning.
To be able to get a name relatively quickly in the investigation was a great boost for us. But along with that enthusiasm, knowing who Patrick McGonigal was, also came the idea that if we're talking about Charlestown, if we're talking about the suspects being from Charlestown, that this code of silence, the fact that nobody talks down there, that while it looked like it was moving quickly, we realized that it was going to be a long haul.
Investigators knew he rented the yellow truck in Medford, Massachusetts, just outside of Boston and near Charlestown. They prepared to put one of their own undercover at the rental agency in case McGonigal returned the truck himself. But as they began working, they received word of possible new evidence. A white sedan, thought to be linked with the Hudson robbery, was burning in Revere, Massachusetts, 5 miles from Charlestown. The investigators hoped something might survive the fire that would put them on the killer's trail. In Hudson, New Hampshire, 2 armored car guards were shot in cold blood. Their bodies were found abandoned in the woods.
No!
The gunman took nearly $500,000 and then vanished. Police were trying to piece together the evidence to find the killers before they took more lives, when they learned of a burning car that might hold the clues they sought, according to New Hampshire State Police Detective Sergeant Tim Pickell.
The car that was found burning in Revere, Massachusetts, was found at an early morning hour. It was the Revere Fire Department and Police Department were on the scene.
The night of the robbery, police and firefighters were called to the scene of a burning white sedan in Revere, Massachusetts, less than 50 miles from the murder scene. They thought the car might be the one they sought in connection with the robbery. The FBI was called in to investigate. To firemen, it was obvious the fire had been set intentionally. Fortunately for investigators, the arsonist had closed the trunk.
Look at this, huh?
The lack of oxygen starved the fire, preserving precious evidence.
This car was apparently burned to destroy evidence, and we're very thankful it was done in a poor fashion because we recovered an enormous amount of evidence from that car.
A burned T-shirt had the name Boston Bandits on it, with an illustration of a leprechaun robbing an armored car.
Oh, mask.
They also found a charred Halloween mask matching the one found at the murder scene. But the most interesting piece of evidence was the deposit slips from banks and stores on the armored car's route.
I want you to run a plate for me. Massachusetts.
The car's license plates were stolen.
288L, August.
They turned to the vehicle identification number, or VIN, to find out who owned it.
So that gives us another area to pursue. Now, where did this vehicle come from, and who the owner is, and how did it get into the hands of this crew?
When police ran the VIN number, they discovered the car had been reported stolen. The next morning, investigators went to talk with the owner of the car.
The owner told us that he brought the car to the dealership the night before and had taken the keys and put it in the night deposit drop for the mechanics to work on it in the morning.
Do you mind taking a look at this?
The agents went to the dealership in question.
That's yours?
The folks there told us they never received the keys. This was a break in the chain somewhere. Did the owner actually bring the vehicle up there, or did the vehicle actually never make it there and go somewhere else?
Could you just give me a call? I'm going to leave you my card and get in touch. It's very important. Okay?
The white car seemed like a dead end. The investigators' other vehicle lead was the truck, rented by known Charlestown organized crime figure Patrick McGonigal. They asked for help from Massachusetts State Trooper Edward Principe.
The New Hampshire State Police had information that a vehicle used during the robbery had been rented in the Boston area, and they wanted us to surveil the location and to await the return of the truck. I went into the truck rental company. I advised the people at the counter that we were expecting a vehicle. If the vehicle was to enter the premises, they were not to touch the vehicle. We needed to preserve any evidence that might be available.
Police and FBI staked out the rental agency to see if McGonigal would return the truck.
2 of us were to remain with the vehicle and secure it for crime scene processing. 2 of the other troopers were to follow the driver of the truck with whomever he left with.
They were surprised to see McGonigal drive in to return the truck. Principe watched as one of the rental truck employees walked over to meet him. To make sure nothing went wrong, Principe moved in.
I immediately ran into the front door of the rental location. I asked one of the employees for his shirt.
You know, Tommy? Yeah.
I took my shirt off. I put his shirt on.
Tell him to stay right here and don't move.
I grabbed all the rental paperwork that needed to be signed by Mr. McGonigal. He seemed very calm at the time. Now, my whole mission was to stall him for as long as possible so that surveillance could set up and everyone would be ready to follow him out of there. I stalled him for about 10-15 minutes. I explained to him there was a snafu with the paperwork. He bought the story hook, line, and sinker. He waited around. I could see he was, somewhat impatient, but he seemed to understand that the paperwork had to be taken care of before he could leave.
Surveillance agents followed the car that picked up McGonigal. As they followed him, the truck was taken to the police impound facility. FBI evidence technician Charles Walsh wasted no time setting out to try and prove that this was the truck at the scene where the bodies were found. He knew he was lucky they had found the truck so quickly.
It's important to get the vehicle as quickly as possible because if the vehicle is out there and it's being utilized, the tires are picking up that many more characteristics that weren't there on the day that the crime took place.
They took tire impressions from the vehicle.
We had to leave the tire on the truck because you can't take a tire off a vehicle and expect to get the same characteristics because of the difference in tire pressure and the weight that was borne on the tire itself. And we fashioned a sandbox, if you will, and then we took sand, wet sand, and packed it in, and then we drove the truck over the sandbox and made an impression of the tire.
Technicians photographed the impression to compare with the dental stone cast taken at the Hudson murder scene.
Our tire impression is just like a fingerprint impression. There are no 2 tire impressions that are identical. After the tire has been used and worn, it accepts these characteristics like glass cuts, stone cuts, nails, and so on and so forth that are just as unique as fingerprint details. The tire impression had 2 chunks out of the tread itself that was pretty unique just from the on-scene examination. So we knew we were on to something just by that tire impression right there.
With the tire impressions taken, technicians processed the rest of the truck. Inside, they discovered red carpet fibers that were the same color as the carpeting in the maroon minivan left at the Hudson murder site. They dusted the entire exterior for fingerprints. They lifted a single usable print. All the evidence would be sent to the lab. They would run the print through the Massachusetts fingerprint identification database in hopes of finding a match and possibly the killer. 2 armored car guards were brutally murdered in Hudson, New Hampshire. As their families in the community mourned and the men's bodies were laid to rest, police were still trying to capture their killers. Forensic technicians in New Hampshire were still processing a rental truck they believed was linked to the murders. The truck was rented by a known crime figure in Boston named Patrick McGonigal. But the link wasn't strong enough to make an arrest or their case, according to prosecutor David Vicinanzo.
There is a frustration that law enforcement often feels, but the fact is we have rules, and the rules require evidence, and evidence to prove a case to a certain standard of proof, in this case beyond a reasonable doubt. Although it was pretty clear after we recovered that yellow moving truck that that moving truck had been involved, it was not clear, beyond a reasonable doubt anyway, who had operated it, who had actually been involved. It required greater evidence.
As the truck was being processed, investigators tailed Patrick McGonigal to the Ironside Grill, a Charlestown bar known as a hangout for criminals. They were keeping a close watch on him. Investigators could see from his history and his rap sheet that McGonigal could be dangerous.
He was almost 60 years old at that time, but had a criminal record extending back until into his teens. Probably most significantly, he had been convicted in the 70s and 80s of a series of truck hijackings and armored car robberies.
McGonigal never worked alone, and he would not have been the trigger man. Investigators photographed anyone seen entering or leaving the bar. They believe McGonigal's associates might meet him at the location. When the evidence from the truck came back, investigators were convinced the yellow truck rented by Patrick McGonigal was used in the Hudson robbery.
It's not just that the tire tread itself matches in the size and the width and all the dimensions, but they identify a chunk out of the tire that has kind of been pulled out of the tire because of some road trauma, hitting a curb or a rock or something like that. And this thing is so distinctive that the likelihood that this would have been a coincidence is nil. And it's clearly the truck that was used there that day.
Other forensic evidence analyzed included the red fibers found inside the yellow truck. Experts matched them to a carpet sample taken from the maroon minivan in which Ron Normando's body was found. Investigators went to Charlestown to talk with Patrick McGonigal, according to New Hampshire State Trooper Tim Pickell.
What we wanted to do with Patrick McGonigal was to find out what his alibi was, what his story was as to where he took the vehicle, and cover the entire time that he had the vehicle.
Agents explained they were investigating the Hudson robbery and interviewing everyone who rented trucks from the rental franchise. At first, McGonigal denied renting a truck. The investigators furnished him with the rental receipt.
Remember when you got it, what you did with it?
His signature was on the agreement. His memory cleared up.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, now you
I
remember,
rented
huh?
this truck for a one-day deal. It was lugging some water jugs.
For one day.
He said he rented the vehicle the day before the Hudson murders.
I left the truck with the keys in it and I was gone.
He left the vehicle in the warehouse parking lot with the keys in it and had no idea how it had been used that day.
Whatever happened after that?
He said he returned the truck the following morning.
Patrick McGonigal told us what he did with the van, and it was a matter of going to one location, picking up some water, and bringing it back to another location. And by interviewing him, we could find out what he did with the van, and then actually drive that route to see if, in fact, that satisfied the amount of mileage that was expended with the van. We found that we could drive up to New Hampshire, do what he did, and still have mileage to spare.
Investigators checked out McGonigal's story further. They talked to the man who took delivery of the water.
So how often does McGonigal come around here?
He backed McGonigal's version of events.
Nah, he's a businessman, Pat. You know.
All right, so you're around here all the time?
The details of the story seemed to match too perfectly, as if they'd been rehearsed. they'd run headfirst into Charlestown's code of silence. They then turned to their strongest piece of physical evidence, the fingerprint found on the truck. It did not belong to McGonigal. They learned the print belonged to a convicted bank robber named Stephen Burke.
Stephen Burke is a fellow with a long robbery history. His first conviction was at the age of 17. He does a little bit of time in the mass system, gets out, immediately starts doing other robberies, and finally does a pretty significant stretch of time in a federal facility for a robbery in which he shot it out with the police and wounded a police officer.
But during the surveillance of McGonigal, the men were never seen together and didn't seem to be enjoying the spoils of a $500,000 heist.
Yeah, this is Burke. We picked up his prints.
Stephen Burke's modest living may have been part of a plan.
Burke was a true professional. He kept a very low profile. One of his philosophies was that you never want to flaunt any of the wealth that you make in the course of doing robberies because you don't want to attract attention. Stephen Burke lived a very disciplined life. He was in tremendous physical condition. He did not use drugs and frowned on anybody using drugs.
Undercover detectives like Massachusetts State Trooper Edward Troy were well acquainted with Burke's reputation.
Burke had been around a long time. He was a, relatively intelligent guy. He was well schooled by the older criminal element. He was a planner. He was the type of guy that would plan these sort of operations and get people that he knew could count on to help him do it or to do the job themselves.
Investigators began to focus their attention on Burke's known associates. One of the men who helped Burke implement his plans in the past was Michael O'Halloran. His background suggested he may have been involved in the Hudson murders.
O'Halloran had a very lengthy criminal history, had done a lot of time in both federal and state facilities for armed robbery, for bank robbery, for very serious physical assaults, stabbings, and so forth in Charlestown, and was on parole at the time. He was the guy that they call the quiet man because he hardly said a word. Very silent, thoughtful, disciplined, every day at the athletic facility lifting weights or running, and in very, very good physical condition, much like Stephen Burke, who happened to be his closest friend.
Investigators now had a growing list of suspects, but they were a long way from making any arrests. All they could do was keep up their surveillance if they hoped to identify the gunman who killed the guards. Police knew if they didn't catch them soon, this gang of robbers was certain to strike again. In 1994, New England had been victimized by a series of armored car robberies. Ron Normando and Wes Anderson started their day with over $500,000 inside their truck. As they neared the bank, they had no idea they were being watched.
Okay, boys, just heading in the bank.
Normando made a pickup of cash. As his partner pressed the button to let him in the armored car, the men were attacked by a gang of thieves armed with automatic weapons. Less than a half hour later, an officer spotted the vehicles in a wooded area near the bank. The guards were found inside. Both of the men had been executed. U.S. Attorney David Vicinanzo was at the crime scene.
I have a very distinct memory of looking in the side of the van and seeing Ron Normando's body. Good guy, middle-aged guy, family man, just lying there. And I just looked at him and said, whoever did this, the death penalty isn't good enough for them. You know, I felt that even if they were, the people who did this, forfeit their life, it still wasn't going to bring Ron back.
Police were searching for the men who pulled the trigger and found links to a band of criminals in Charlestown, Massachusetts.
Charlestown was best known as the bank robbery and armored car robbery capital of the Northeast, even the East Coast.
Charlestown was a dangerous place where the police were not welcome.
Sometimes the police would go to a homicide scene and they would learn that there were 25 witnesses, but nobody saw anything.
No one was talking to police, and agents turned their attention to the physical evidence. A white, burned-out car linked to the robbery was found the night of the murders. The owner said it had been stolen from the dealership, but something about the story didn't ring true. Investigators began to apply more pressure. They subpoenaed the employee from the car dealership who had first said the car was stolen from the dealership parking lot. In front of a grand jury and under penalty of perjury, he now told a different story. He admitted the chain of events began with the car's owner, according to Special Agent Jim Haskell.
The owner of that white sedan had leased it through a local car company, and the owner was not happy with the vehicle. He wanted to get out from under the lease. Well, it was difficult for people to break automobile leases, so he worked in concert with an individual at the dealership, and the individual at the dealership said he could make the car disappear for him, and that way he could report it to his insurance company as a stolen vehicle, and the insurance company would have to pay him off.
To dispose of the car, the service manager called a friend in Charlestown named Mark Windell. He took the car off the lot the night before the Hudson murders. Armed with this new information, investigators took a closer look at Mark Windell and discovered he had no criminal record. But they'd seen his face before. They photographed him entering the Charlestown bar shortly after suspect Patrick McGonigal on the day after the murders.
Mark, take a seat over there, please.
The FBI brought him in for questioning.
Mark, what did you do with the car?
He admitted driving the vehicle off the dealership's lot and parking it in front of his home.
I parked it at my house.
But when he woke up the next morning, he told investigators it had been stolen.
I know it sounds funny, but you have to believe me.
To agents, it was obvious he was lying. But they had no way to prove it. They threatened Windell. They would bring him up in front of a grand jury.
Okay, we'll make sure that the judge knows that. Thank you, Mike.
The decision whether he would talk or take the fall for his friends was now in his hands. While investigators searched for anyone who could shed light on the case, at headquarters they found some striking similarities between the Hudson robbery and previous robberies in New England.
There were other robberies where we had found a screwdriver stuck in the seat on one of the getaway vehicles. And what we learned was that the screwdriver was put there as an easy way to start the car once you had taken out the ignition. If you knew how to do it, you could hotwire it with the screwdriver.
1 year earlier, in Seabrook, New Hampshire, a minivan with a handicap sticker and tinted windows was in the parking lot of the First New Hampshire Bank. Like the Hudson robbery, the rear seats of the minivan were removed to allow the robbers to hide. And like the Hudson robbery, the gunmen waited for their window of opportunity to strike.
Drop the gun! Drop it! Drop it! Drop it and pull your head off! Drop it! Do it! Do it!
heist.
They got away with $280,000. But unlike the Hudson robbery, the Seabrook armored car crew was later found alive and uninjured. The getaway van was located the night after the robbery. Inside was the same stripped ignition and screwdriver in the seat. In all, investigators uncovered similarities between the Hudson robbery and 10 bank and armored car robberies. But despite the matching MOs in the 10 robberies, no guards were hurt in any of the incidents. If it was the same group of robbers, then something must have gone wrong during the Hudson robbery. Prosecutor David Vicinanzo had a theory on why their latest robbery turned deadly.
What appears to have happened is that the initial shot was fired by one of the robbers, either inadvertently or in a panic, and that once Ron Normando, the courier guard, had taken a shot in the side and gone down, the rules all changed. At that point, it became clear that this was no longer just a robbery, but a murder situation, and possibly a multiple murder situation. And these professional robbers responded in a very cold-blooded, calculated way. They decided these guards were not going to live to be able to tell the tale.
To bring these killers to justice, investigators had to crack the code of silence. New Hampshire state police officers like Timothy Pickell were determined to find people who would talk.
Once you start getting names of people, you know who their associates are. You can find their associates, and that's very important. We found their girlfriends, we found their wives. And these people have a tendency to talk to other people.
Investigators were beginning to find some success, according to Hudson Police Sergeant Ray Mello.
There were a lot of people that also found this crime offensive, vicious, and brutal, and that were willing to talk to us.
The evidence was building against the Charlestown suspects, but it was mostly circumstantial, according to prosecutor David Vicinanzo.
We did get some informants, but a lot of them were anonymous. Others were unwilling to talk for the record, even though we knew their identity. Ultimately, this became a process of breaking down that code of silence, step by step.
Word on Charlestown's streets was 2 paroled bank robbers were in on the Hudson job. Their names were Anthony Shea and Matthew McDonald.
Here we go. Remember to lay low. Don't spend the money in one place.
The 2 were paroled from Walpole State Prison at about the same time as Stephen Burke and Michael O'Halloran. Investigators immediately began surveillance on McDonald and Shea. Detectives who had worked undercover in Charlestown were already well familiar with Matthew McDonald.
Matty McDonald had a reputation for being just an out-of-control, vicious person. He was recruited probably because of that reputation. That craziness that he had when you mix that in with the drugs, heroin and angel dust, that he was known to be involved in, it's just a very dangerous mixture.
Surveillance units rarely saw Matthew McDonald without Anthony Shea.
It became important in this case to look at the conspiracy, the agreement between these people. So it was important for us to show that these suspects are meeting together after the crime, or show that they're meeting with specific people, then trying to go talk to those people that they're meeting with.
As police began to put together a list of suspects, they kept finding more and more dangerous criminals involved. They needed to find a way to get them off the streets before they killed again. The FBI was investigating 5 known criminals from Charlestown, Massachusetts, who they believed were involved in a series of unsolved armored car and bank robberies all over New England. The MOs were strikingly similar. This gang had shot and killed 2 guards, and investigators knew it would only be a matter of time before the robbers would kill again. The FBI maintained round-the-clock surveillance on the suspects and area banks. They were looking for anything that would give them enough to make an arrest.
All right, there comes a guard.
As police surveillance continued, it began to look as if the gang would strike again, according to FBI Special Agent Jim Haskell.
They went through a series of well-planned steps, a 3-month surveillance of the actual armored car. They would watch the car, they would follow it along its route, they would know who the driver and the courier were, what they looked like, where they parked.
The suspect's behavior was suspicious. Another armored car robbery seemed imminent. There was little the investigators could do but try and maintain a close watch. With such tenacious surveillance, it wasn't long before the professional criminals noticed they were being followed.
See if he comes right up to us.
All of the individuals involved in this crew were very surveillance conscious. And when the surveillance squad would be attempting to follow them around, they would do things like drive the wrong way up a one-way street to see if anybody followed them. They'd intentionally drive up an exit ramp on a major thoroughfare to see if anybody followed them.
Agents working undercover, like Hudson Police Sergeant Ray Mello, found it nearly impossible to blend in with the Charlestown population.
Charlestown's a very tight-knit community where everybody knows everybody. When you start talking about some of the housing developments that we were working around in, you know, I think it's pretty obvious a lot of times who the police officers are and who's not a police officer. They knew we were there.
No, I'm good. That's from the gentleman over here.
Investigators discovered an unintended benefit from their intrusive surveillance, according to U.S. Attorney David Vicinanzo.
For probably 6 to 8 months, there was so much heat on the Charlestown neighborhood because of this that almost nothing did happen. No other robberies, and the reason we heard back through informants was that everybody was lying low because they were afraid of prosecution and incarceration. There was just too much heat around, so it's better to lie low and just wait till time passes.
But soon it appeared the suspects all dropped out of sight. Despite heavy surveillance, Stephen Burke and Anthony Shea seemed to have disappeared from the Charlestown area. Investigators were convinced they were preparing to strike another target. They warned New England banks and armored car companies to take extra precautions. They never guessed the warning should have extended 1,500 miles south to Florida. May 11th, 1995, 9 months after the Hudson murders at a West Palm Beach bank. Another handicap sticker on another nondescript minivan. And another armored car crew putting their lives on the line. The robbery began with eerie similarities to the Hudson tragedy. They wounded the courier in the foot. The robbers were becoming more dangerous. And once again, they were willing to kill to get what they wanted. But like the Hudson robbery, something in the plan went wrong. They could not overpower the guard. It was taking too long, and the firefight would attract law enforcement. The robbers cut their losses and fled, leaving the minivan behind. 2 Florida law enforcement agents saw the gunmen as they fled the parking lot. They'd heard the gunshots outside the bank and pursued the men as they fled.
Come on, forget about it, come on!
The gunman had planted another getaway vehicle.
Hurry up! Come on, get in the back, get in the back! Give me the gun! Here we go! Go, 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 go!
The agents were not in a police car, and their van struggled to keep up with the faster SUV. They wanted to shoot out one of the SUV's tires to slow it down. But they were outgunned by the suspects and had to drive evasively, making it much harder to get a shot off. For their own safety, the officers were forced to pull back and follow at a distance. It gave the suspects a handful of valuable seconds. They had a drop location where they had yet another vehicle waiting.
Right, over! Here we go!
For Boston-based FBI Special Agent Jim Haskell, the level of planning matched the Charlestown robbery crew.
One of the things they would frequently look for in a getaway route would be some type of barrier where they could abandon the initial getaway car. And if there was a pursuit, then the police would be stopped by this barrier, whether it's a fence, a hedgerow, a gully. And that's exactly what happened.
After the wounded courier was transported to the hospital, local police and the FBI processed the parking lot of the West Palm Beach Bank for evidence. The incident had taken place 1,500 miles away from Massachusetts, but it wasn't long before the FBI in Boston heard about it.
Every FBI office has what they call a bank robbery coordinator, and this individual will review the facts and details about every bank robbery that occurs throughout the country, looking for similar MOs. The attempted armored car robbery that occurred in West Palm Beach bore several of the similarities that we found in the Seabrook robbery and the Hudson robbery. Initially, we just strongly suspected their involvement.
Back in Boston, investigators looked for any evidence that one or more of the suspects could have been in Florida. They had been watching Stephen Burke's credit card usage.
On the day of the West Palm Beach robbery, we found gas transactions that began in Florida. The next transaction, I believe, was like in South Carolina, and then the next transaction was in Baltimore. The final transaction was in Connecticut. So we could see a route of someone using Stephen Burke's credit card heading back towards the Boston area.
Using a credit card that could be traced was an uncharacteristic move for Burke. But agents theorized that because the heist was unsuccessful, the men didn't have enough cash to make the trip home. Boston investigators stepped up their efforts to locate the suspects. But there was no sign of them on Charlestown's streets. Special Agent Jim Haskell knew at least one of the suspects couldn't lay low very long.
Anthony Shea had a serious drug problem, and maybe that was the reason, he had to continually find a source of money.
A bank in Londonderry, New Hampshire, 3 months after the Florida attempted robbery, nearly a year after the Hudson murders. At 7 p.m., the bank closed. Only 2 women remained. The robbers demanded the head teller open the safe. But she didn't know the code. The robbers didn't believe her. They said they'd kill her unless the vault was opened. The gunmen were running out of time. They gave up and left the money behind.
Stay right there. You don't say anything. You hear me? You hear me?
But they didn't make a clean getaway. The FBI lost track of a Boston-based gang of bank robbers. They had broken into a bank in Londonderry, New Hampshire. The bank was closed and only 2 women remained inside. The robbers demanded the head teller open the safe. They threatened to kill her if she didn't. But neither of the tellers knew how to open it. Once again, the gunmen were running out of time. They gave up and left the money behind.
Don't call anyone at all. I mean it. Stay right there. You don't say anything. You hear me? You hear me?
But they also left behind important evidence. Londonderry police and the FBI processed the scene into the night. Agents questioned the witnesses who described their ordeal. They said one of the robbers cut himself on the broken glass as he fled out the window. The bloody glass shards were collected and sent to the FBI lab for DNA processing.
When they went out the window, did you...
Agents believe the suspect's injury may have been serious enough to require medical attention.
How much?
Investigators canvassed local hospitals.
Excuse me. Hi, Special Agent Sawyer with the FBI. You mind if I ask you a few questions?
They found one that treated a patient for severe cuts to the hand on the evening of the Londonderry bank robbery.
Good, thank you.
Yeah.
Records showed the patient's name was Ned Davis, a known Charlestown bank robber.
I'll look at a few pictures that I have of him. Is this...
As she looked through the mugshots, including the photos of Davis, she didn't recognize him.
Good look, man. No one looks familiar.
They then showed the nurse mugshots of other known bank robbers with whom Davis was known to associate.
The gentleman who came in here with the hand injury?
She identified Anthony Shea as the man she treated.
This is him. Are you sure? This is the man who came in?
Yes.
Back in Charlestown, surveillance teams picked up on Shea. He had bandaged hands, further suggesting Shea was the masked robber in Londonderry. Anthony Shea knew he was being watched. Hudson Police Sergeant Ray Mello no longer bothered to be discreet in his surveillance.
We wanted to make it very uncomfortable for them to move around. We wanted them to know that we were trying to watch what they were doing.
Investigators turned to the evidence they had discovered on the night the armored car guards were found murdered. Someone had torched a car in Revere, Massachusetts. Inside the trunk was a series of important pieces of evidence, all tied to the armored car heist in Hudson, New Hampshire. Whoever burnt the car was part of the gang who killed the guards. But the car could not be linked to the owner because he asserted it had been stolen. Investigators thought someone was holding back key information. They needed Mark Wendell to talk. FBI Special Agent Jim Haskell used the most powerful weapon they had.
The greatest tool in penetrating the code of silence was the federal grand jury system itself, where individuals can be brought in to testify, and they can either refuse to testify, or if they do testify and they testify falsely, then they can be charged with an additional crime of perjury.
When Mark Wendell was brought before a grand jury, he repeated the same story he told investigators even though he was now under oath. He said he accepted the stolen white car from the dealership, but someone had stolen it from him the next morning. The manager of the car lot did not tell the same story. Prosecutor David Vicinanzo caught Wendell.
Turns out Mark Wendell lied under oath, and we were able to prove it. We indicted him for perjury and obstruction of justice, charged him, took him to trial, and convicted him. Mark Wendell, because of the seriousness of the crime, received a sentence of 10 years in the federal prison.
In the end, Wendell chose 10 years over the death sentence he'd received for ratting on members of Charlestown's underworld. It was yet another illustration of just how hard it would be to completely break Charlestown's code of silence. But the gang was starting to feel the pressure of the investigation and was beginning to self-destruct. One of the suspected robbers, Matthew McDonald, put himself behind bars. He was arrested for spousal battery, a violation of his parole. With McDonald in jail, investigators kept up surveillance on his partner, Anthony Shea. August 8th, 1995. Agents observed Shea and another man stealing an SUV. They couldn't be sure whether it was a start of something bigger, so they kept a close watch on him. They knew the Charlestown crew used stolen vehicles in all of their robberies.
It's going to be Massachusetts tag 779, Oscar Charlie Charlie.
He called in the license plate numbers on the accomplice's pickup truck.
Red Dodge pickup.
It was also stolen. As the agent watched the suspects pre-position a getaway vehicle, they were certain another robbery was imminent. The only question was where.
Let's get them, guys. They're going to do this.
As a precaution, the agent called for backup and asked SWAT to assist.
Taking another left. The bank's right around the corner from here.
98 still southbound on aim. It's coming up to 10. 10-4.
When the suspects turned into the parking lot of a Wakefield, Massachusetts bank, the agents and SWAT confronted them. The man with Anthony Shea was identified as Ned Davis, the name Shea gave when he was treated for cuts to his hand. Agents recovered a pistol from Shea. They discovered more incriminating evidence in the stolen vehicle. With several of the 5 suspects arrested, investigators still needed more evidence to arrest the remaining 3. The evidence came to them. Agents tied Mark Wendell to a burned-out stolen white car linked to the Hudson murders. He accepted a 10-year sentence for perjury rather than violate Charlestown's code of silence. But now Wendell was having second thoughts.
He's a guy that never been to prison before. The idea of going to jail for 10 years was a very scary prospect. Within days, Wendell's lawyer called me and said he wants to talk. Wendell was not a guy with a criminal record, was not a hardened guy, was not a criminal. He just happened to be somebody who got too close to criminals. And he played around and he got burned.
Are you still willing?
Wendell told investigators he had given the white car to Michael O'Halloran.
If I can help you with... I need a conviction.
He asserted O'Halloran did not tell him in advance what he was going to do with it.
I lent the car to Mikey O'Halloran.
The next time he saw the car, it was on television and on fire.
He said he needed it for an errand. He didn't tell me what he was going to do.
Wendell panicked and called O'Halloran, who told him it had been used in the Hudson robbery.
He came by, I gave him the keys, and that's the last I saw.
Prosecutors convinced Wendell to testify in exchange for the possibility of a reduced sentence.
What else did you know involved in this?
Even with his testimony, they still needed more cooperating witnesses to make their case. But the streets of Charlestown remained quiet.
What job he did out the Cape.
The one way to break the code of silence would be to get Anthony Shea to inadvertently break it himself.
You're kidding me, huh?
They recruited a prisoner named Keith Franklin for the task.
Because the two of them had both had a long robbery history, they talked a lot. Now, Franklin is the kind of guy who, because of his own criminal history, is going to be in jail for a long time. And what the federal government has is, even for incarcerated people who cooperate, is a witness protection program.
Franklin agreed to wear a wire. FBI agents fitted him inside the prison. He was placing himself in grave danger. If Shea found out he was working with the feds, Franklin would be killed.
Did it with the Hudson job, man? Let me tell you something. It was the best thing in the world.
Shea was taped talking to Franklin about a lot of his robbery history, in particular the Hudson robbery and what had happened there. Shea told him about not only the Hudson robbery, but also an armored car that he and his crew, meaning Stephen Burke, O'Halloran, and Matthew McDonald, had done in Lynn, Massachusetts, had done in Seabrook, New Hampshire, and other robberies throughout New England.
Thanks to the information gathered from Franklin's wire, investigators believed they had enough evidence to arrest the remaining 3 suspects, Stephen Burke, Michael O'Halloran, and Patrick McGonigal. On June 3rd, 1996, investigators planned to take all 3 into custody in a series of synchronized arrests. An assault team surrounded Michael O'Halloran's home. Agents phoned him and told him to come out. He was known as the quiet, disciplined member of the Charlestown crew. He lived up to his reputation. The planner, Patrick McGonigal, was arrested without incident.
Stay right there, don't move.
The final suspect, Stephen Burke, concerned the arresting officers.
We had heard through informants and witnesses that Stephen Burke had said he was never going back to jail again, and that he would shoot it out rather than go to jail.
The assault teams prepared for the worst. The FBI in Boston spent 2 years building their case against the Charlestown underworld. Now they were preparing for the synchronized arrests of 3 remaining suspects wanted for the execution-style murders of 2 New Hampshire armored car couriers and several other robberies. 2 of the remaining suspects had been arrested without incident. The final suspect, Stephen Burke, said he'd shoot it out before going to jail.
Hey guys, get ready to bail out. He's coming out. Let's see if
All right, let's go, guys. Jump, jump.
But caught off guard, Burke was forced to take his chances in court. Hudson Police Chief Richard Gendron was impressed by the way the arrests went down.
One by one, they were all taken out. It was a very efficient operation. They were taken out so quickly they didn't know what was coming.
Although all 5 suspects were now in custody, they remained tight-lipped about their involvement in the Hudson murders. Prosecutors did not know who fired the execution-style rounds into the armored car crew. They couldn't charge the suspects with the murder of the Hudson guards. Instead, they charged them with conspiracy.
You can show that this is not something that's a one-shot deal, but something that for which there's a pattern, a conscious design to actually rob to make money as a crew, as a continuing threat, an ongoing enterprise.
Their trial started on September 24th, 1997, at United States District Court of New Hampshire. Prison inmate Keith Franklin was one of the prosecution's star witnesses.
I like to play them for the court.
He wore a wire in prison, allowing the investigators to record conversations he had with Anthony Shea. The jury heard how the suspects shadowed armored car crews for months before a job. They timed the routes of armored trucks down to the minute. The suspects plotted each job so it would unfold with military precision. They had plans for nearly every contingency should something go wrong. The jury heard Shea's own voice describe what happened in Hudson.
Shea's version of events was that he had been the first guy out of the maroon van, and that the guard, Ron Normando, had reached for his gun, and Shea had, on the spur of the moment, decided to shoot him, and regretted it, wish he hadn't done it, not because he had any mercy on Ron, but because it just made the robbery all the messier and brought all this federal and state and local heat on the crew. He said that Stephen Burke was initially the guy who ran through the door into the armored car.
The tape recording detailed the roles of the other suspects and documented the mistakes they made.
Matthew McDonald had screwed up the job of burning the evidence in the trunk of the white car that was found burning in Revere. He had closed the trunk, which smothered the fire and allowed the evidence to be found.
The tape described a supporting role for Patrick McGonigal.
Generally speaking, McGonigal was viewed as one of the, quote, older guys, who was older, not as physically fit, and not one of the ones who would be selected to actually be jumping out. McGonigal would do something like drive a blocking vehicle, which is driving a vehicle that might block traffic to facilitate a getaway, or might drive a getaway truck or vehicle, such as the yellow moving van in the Hudson case.
The prosecution corroborated eyewitness testimony with forensic evidence. The mask found inside the armored truck in which Wes Anderson was murdered was tested for DNA evidence. Saliva swabbed from inside the mask was genetically linked to Stephen Burke. As investigators suspected, DNA tests on the blood found on the broken glass at the Londonderry Bank matched Anthony Shea. The Boston Bandits t-shirt found in the burned white Mazda was part of a uniform for a softball team at a prison in which Stephen Burke served. In the end, Shea, Burke, O'Halloran, and McDonald were found guilty and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For his supporting role, Patrick McGonigal was sentenced to 30 years, making him 87 years old before he will be released. For Chief Gendron, the realization his investigation was over brought great relief.
The day that the judge read the verdict and sentenced these individuals to life in prison without any chance of parole, and seeing the expressions on the family members, I tell you, made it all worth it.
The residents of Hudson will not soon forget the tragedy this gang of thieves brought to their town.
After this, investigation, we made some changes. We changed our weapons because we were outgunned. We didn't have the right weapons that day. All Hudson police officers wear ballistic vests every day. There are shields in every cruiser. There's a lot of lessons to be learned. But I'm just glad we got these people, and they're never going to do this again.
In all, investigators estimated the men were involved in over 100 bank robberies or armored car heists. In 1997, when the gang was behind bars, the number dwindled to 2. Today, Charlestown's code of silence isn't what it used to be.
Other robbers saw that there was so much heat brought to bear on this neighborhood. They knew that it was never going to be the same again. They saw some of these people who were respected bank robbers who no one ever expected to talk, beginning to talk. And once those guys started to talk, all of a sudden the code was broken and other people began to talk. And while there are still some robberies that emanate from Charlestown, it has never been the same since.
The crime rate in Charlestown has plummeted. Thanks to law enforcement's tireless efforts, the code of silence has been shattered.